With any disease, there are basic requirements in order to have disease, and we pathologists talk about it as a disease triangle. And with late blight, we always have susceptible hosts. There's a lot of us growing tomatoes and potatoes in the U.S., so there's plenty of susceptible hosts. Conditions are often favorable, but the pathogen is what's limiting. And generally speaking, that's been our limiting factor for late blight occurrence. And the reason for that, if we start looking at what the sources are, the most important is infested potato tubers. And that's pretty much going to be in your major potato production areas, or anyone who's not has had late blight and doesn't take care of the potato tubers the next year. Very important source. And then plants in frost-free areas. And that would be southern part of Florida is pretty much it in the U.S. So we've got a limited area where this pathogen can survive, because remember, it's an obligate pathogen. It has to have living host tissue to survive. So from those plants in frost-free areas, they're going to produce those spores that Sally showed you. They're wind dispersed. They easily move. So from there, the pathogen can move to other production areas during the course of the season. And we've had a couple cases, not too many over the years, where plants that are infected have been moved to other areas and the pathogen has come with it. Hasn't happened too often. With tomato transplants it's happened, and we had one situation where we had a strain on petunias. So those are our predominant sources. Those are our sources, I should say, in the United States. It's important to realize that in Europe they now have a new source. In a number of years back, they brought in the pathogen equivalent of the other mating type, the opposite sex. They now have both mating types in some parts of Europe. They have sexual reproduction occurring, and as Sally pointed out, that results in a structure that can survive in the soil in the absence of living host tissue. So if that happens in the U.S., as Sally pointed out, it's worth reiterating, we're going to start seeing late blight much more regularly. So that's a reason to be really aggressive about how we manage late blight, because we sure don't need that to happen here. So a key fact about this pathogen is that it produces these wind-dispersed, and they're asexually produced spores. So it's just cloning itself. It's just continually reproducing, producing these spores that are all the same. It can infect and produce a new spot in as few, with some of these really aggressive strains, just 4 days. But typically it's about 4 to 10 days. You go from spore landing on a leaf to a lesion like this that's producing more spores. And you can see from the numbers, there's just an awful lot of spores on that leaf. And that's where the disease just can escalate, when you've got the right kind of conditions with that amount of inoculum being produced. Now, typically, those who have studied the disease feel that it moves about 15, 20 miles by these spores under normal conditions, but it can move further than that. And we had a situation back in 2007. We had an outbreak on Long Island where I am, saw symptoms on the 26th of August. The nearest known source was a report out of Pennsylvania back in the beginning of August. So that's a pretty big leap that the pathogen apparently had made. And you can just see how devastating it was for this particular grower on this particular planting. The plant's pretty well hit. He did have some fresh fruit. Fruit looked good when he picked it, but you can see the softness at the top of the fruit. Those symptoms all appeared as they sat on the stand. And that's when he really realized he had a problem, as he watched customers picking up this fruit and putting it back down again because of those symptoms. So there's an example of where late blight, the pathogen, just made a huge leap. So that can happen. It doesn't happen that often. Okay, so in the U.S., in recent years, we've had late blight occurring every spring in Florida, at least since 1993. And in recent years, it's continued developing later into the spring than it has in the past. So they're still seeing late blight into May since 2005. That means the pathogen's present. It's producing spores at a time of the year where we do have production north of Florida. So now those spores have a place to be dispersed and to land on crops, which was not so much the case prior to 2005. In Maine, we've had, every summer pretty much, they've had late blight in the major potato production area in the north. Because there is so much potato production, the chances of there being infested potatoes is pretty high. So they've seen it every year. They've been battling it up there. Most elsewhere, it's pretty sporadic and rare. And this next slide illustrates that there's differences in host virulence, which is important to realize. The potato strain really hits potatoes. Usually potatoes are hit pretty hard. But this past year, we had strains that hit the tomatoes incredibly hard, very aggressive on the tomatoes, and not so aggressive on the potatoes. So very opposite situation. Now we've got strains that are real potato strains where we've been used to this disease being a real potato disease. Things are changing. Now this slide illustrates just how sporadic late blight can occur in some regions. This is where I am. I've been here working as a vegetable pathologist since 1988. The first time I saw late blight was in 2002. And you can just see over the years it's very much varied when we've first seen late blight, and often not until quite late in the season, October. At that point where it's almost frost time, not such a big issue when it appears that late in the season. And contrast that with Maine. Up in the major potato production area, they see late blight every year, and it's around about the same time, depending on when the environmental conditions become favorable for the pathogen, and this is it's coming out of the seed, and that's when the disease is getting started. So very regular in occurrence when it's coming from seed potatoes or volunteers, very sporadic and erratic otherwise in other areas, such as where I am. Last year, we had detected our usual, what we call the usual potato strain, this one that's been named US 8 that's been occurring in Maine the past few years. That one occurred again, but we had 5 mostly new genotypes that had not been seen before, and they were all on tomato. In most of the Northeast, it was this US 22, but a couple new strains that occurred. Most of these genotypes, most of these strains that we were detecting were one of the mating types. The second mating type was detected in a couple areas. No evidence yet that we've got oospores forming in the U.S., but it does show us that that possibility is there. It's knocking on the door that one of these days those two opposite mating types may by chance come together and we'll have oospores formed. This year, so far, occurrences in Florida, as usual. They've had late blight occurring through May, not quite as much as past years because the really cold weather back in January knocked the late blight back quite a bit. But it still occurred, had some occurrences in Louisiana. And then since then, we've had a couple very limited outbreaks. Often in these areas, it's just been one sighting so far. So for instance, where I am in New York, we've had one garden confirmed as having late blight, and likewise in Connecticut, just one outbreak so far. So pretty limited to date. It'll just be a matter of time to see where things go. Most of those reports have been on tomato and all various places. We found it in greenhouses, high tunnels, case in retail stores. Predominantly that's been in Canada this year, gardens, fields. So real variation as to where we're seeing late blight. That's important to keep in mind. What we haven't figured out yet is the source for all the late blight outbreaks so far this year. We think it's infested potato tubers, but we haven't been able to pinpoint sources for any of these fields. Part of the challenge is since these tomato strains don't like potatoes all that much, we're not going to see a lot of symptoms in an infested potato field. Another complication is since these strains don't like potatoes that much, when they've infested a tuber, they're not destroying the tuber quite as much as the really aggressive strains. So much better chance for the pathogen to survive in these potato tubers. And I think this is part of the community aspects of this disease. We really need to all work together, and when we have outbreaks this year, talk about it, try to figure out what the source was, because from that understanding of where the pathogen's surviving, we're going to be much better able to control it in the future. So that ends my little section on occurrence, and we can move on to management.